Okay, welcome everyone. We're going to go ahead and get started as we're still letting some folks in. But bienvenidas a todas. Hello, I am Catherine Tracy Good, Tracy to my friends and colleagues, and the director of the Tools for Researchers program at the Americas Research Network, or ARENET. And I'm happy that you've been able to join us for this presentation in our Researching the Americas series. We are thrilled to have our former transnational fellow, Bryan Winston, here to talk about his work on Mexican communities in the lower Midwest of the United States. Before we get started, just a few words on logistics. After the interview, we will open up the floor for questions from the audience. To participate in the Q&A, please send a message via the chat function. You usually can find that at the bottom of the screen with your question. We will put you in the virtual queue, and when it is your turn, we will unmute you individually so that you can ask your question to Bryan directly. Also, please be advised that this presentation is being recorded and will be uploaded to ARENET's various platforms. By participating in the Q&A, you are giving your consent to being recorded. If you prefer not to be recorded but would like to ask a question, I would be happy to read it for you from the chat. Now, let me introduce you to Dr. Bryan Winston. Bryan Winston is a former ARENET Transnational Fellow who conducted research in Mexico City in 2016 and is currently the postdoctoral fellow for the Dartmouth Digital History Initiative, an open source digital humanities project launched in 2019 at Dartmouth College. His research and teaching focus on US migration and labor history, Latinx history, race and ethnicity, transnationalism, oral history, and digital humanities. Winston's current book project, Mexican Corridors, Migration and Community Formation in the Lower Midwest, 1900 to 1950, is a transnational account and analysis of ethnic Mexican life in Missouri, Kansas, and Nebraska during the first half of the 20th century. Complementing the monograph in progress is a digital history project, Mapping the Mexican Midwest, that visualizes Mexican migration routes, institutions, and social networks in the Lower Midwest. You can read more about his research in his articles, Mexican Community Formation in Nebraska, 1910 to 1950, in the journal History Nebraska, and Mexican Migrants in Urban Missouri, Social Welfare Institutions and Racial Boundaries in Kansas City and St. Louis, 1915 to 1940, from the Missouri Historical Review. And you can find links to both of those in the About section from the Digital History Project, Mapping the Mexican Midwest. So when you go to check out the project, you'll also be able to find those articles. Okay, let me stop sharing my screen, and we can get started, Bryan. My first question for you today is, your research considers the role of Mexican migrants in the lower Midwest of the United States and their attempts to create community and maintain identity. Much of this is mediated by the Mexican consulates located across the region through the establishment or incorporation of social organizations and hosting celebrations, the Fiestas Patrias, to bring communities together. How did Mexicans, through their local consulates, create and maintain communities?
Great. First, I just want to thank you again for inviting me to talk about my research. And I want to thank the folks that are here. And I look forward to hearing their questions at the end of the interview. That's a great question. And so while I focus a lot of my work on consuls, I have this larger overarching framework, and I look at labor networks, social and cultural networks, and political and legal networks that Mexican migrants created in the Midwest in the first half of the 20th century, specifically the lower Midwest, which I define as Kansas, Nebraska, and Missouri. And despite this larger approach I take, consulates are at least involved in all these aspects of these networks. And so what I'm really concerned about overall with my book project, my work, and specifically with consulates, is how the migrants and consuls maintain urban-rural connections during this time. And so I argue that actually Mexican migrants created a regional community in the lower Midwest, that it wasn't just a community in an urban space or a rural space, that they were connecting these spaces throughout the first half of the 20th century. And so the way consuls facilitated this was really how Mexican migrants interacted with consuls and the consulates. And so while Mexican migrants created labor networks often on their own and through employers, they would often write to the local consul, or I guess local isn't always the right word, because sometimes they're in Western Nebraska and they're writing to a consulate in Kansas City, Missouri. But that consulate and the consul in Kansas City, Missouri, or in St. Louis, Missouri, oversaw a larger space. So as far as labor goes, the migrants would write the consul for protection on the job. They had an employer that they felt was exploitative, and they would petition the consul to intervene on their behalf. Or maybe a Mexican laborer was hurt on the job or even killed on the job, and then their families would write the consul and ask for help in securing compensation. And so this really helped foster community, because just from an economic standpoint, migrants are trying to survive in the region. And if the breadwinner dies or is hurt, they need to find another way to support the family. And so getting this worker compensation was huge. So that's one way, is through these labor networks that migrants are creating a regional community, and the consul is facilitating that, or at least supporting that. Another way is through cultural celebrations. And this really is a point where the consul plays a big role. And so for those that don't know, Fiestas Patrias, the national holidays of Mexico, one important one in the lower Midwest was the celebration of Mexican Independence Day. And so this every September, on September 15th and September 16th, Mexican migrants would organize these big festivals in cities and rural spaces and celebrate Mexican Independence Day. And while they were organizing that locally, they often needed money to pay for spaces or to supply food for the guests. And they would write to their consulate in Kansas City or in St. Louis and request these funds. Sometimes they would even invite the consul and host him, and it was always a him in this case, host him as the guest of honor for the event. And so this was a really important to community building, because not only was it bringing all the Mexican migrants of that city or of that town together, but it was often pulling from other parts of the state. And so you would have, in 1926, for example, 15,000, or according to the papers, 15,000 Mexicans come to Kansas City. And the population at the time in 1926 was less than 10,000. So clearly, they're pulling from other places in Kansas and Missouri. And you even have places like Wellington, Kansas, and Chanute, Kansas, these rural towns that are attracting Mexican migrants from throughout the state and even from other states. And so that aid from the consul was important in making these events successful. And you also had consuls building or helping build institutions. And so Mexican migrants were creating social organizations, cultural organizations, political organizations. And sometimes they were doing this on their own and had no ties to the consulate, but often the consulate was also helping them or encouraging them, I guess is the nice way to say it, of creating Comisiones Honoríficas Mexicanas. And these were patriotic organizations, essentially, that played a major role in Mexican communities throughout the region. And I won't get too in-depth into that now. I hope to talk about that a little more later. But generally, the Comisiones, they were a source of leadership for a community. They were a way to gather resources from the consulate and funnel them to their community, and just a place to create a sense of cohesion, whether they were organizing events or responding to requests from migrants that lived in the town they were in. And so I already talked a little bit about how migrants petitioned the consul or asked for assistance from the consul. And some other ways they did this was when they faced discrimination or political or legal obstacles. And so you would have a community, sometimes through their comisión, other times of their own accord, writing about being denied service at public accommodations or being segregated at a movie theater or something like that, and hoping the consul would intervene on their behalf. And you would also have them, you would have migrants or their family members writing about someone being incarcerated and hoping that the consul could help with their release, whether they were in a local prison or a state prison or even a federal penitentiary. And finally, and we can talk about this more later if folks would like, they were also writing about repatriation. And we know a lot about repatriation, Mexican repatriation in the Southwest during the 1930s, and also in the upper Midwest during the 1930s. And it was also occurring in the lower Midwest, but had a different character than these other regions. And it was because of the partially because of the relationship between Mexican migrants and the consul.
Excellent. That's so interesting. I think it's fascinating how that it's this regional the consuls are functioning in this regional sense, not just in an urban sense in terms of where they might actually be located, and that it crosses state lines. That it's not, it's about a kind of larger region rather than just the state lines, and that difference between the idea that people are they're using their consuls for quite practical reasons, but that there's also or consulates for these quite practical reasons, but there's also this the practice both from the consulate and also from the from individuals in the community using the consulate for community formation and maintenance of identity as well. So that leads into my next question. And I had the pleasure to be able to read part of Bryan's dissertation. And so my questions focus more on this idea of community formation and identity maintenance rather than, and really sort of identity creation as well, creating an identity in a new space, more than on the practical use of the consulates. And I was struck by the fact that the local consulates functioned as this central node through which members of Mexican communities came together, both through contact initiated by individuals and through the organizing efforts by the consulates. And I'm wondering if you could tell us more about these Comisiones Honoríficas Mexicanas. And you also in the chapter mentioned the Brigadas de la Cruz Azul, and how this creation of social organizations was important to these processes.
Yeah, so these organizations were essential. So the Comisiones, they were state sanctioned. So in the early 1920s, the Mexican president of the time sent out a decree to the many consuls and consular offices of the United States to say, create these organizations, create them locally, whatever is in your jurisdiction, and see where you can create these. And so what happens in the 1920s is there's a proliferation across the United States. And in the lower Midwest, there's Comisiones popping up in Kansas, in Nebraska, in Missouri, and it is with the approval of the consulate and therefore the Mexican state, but there is also local initiatives to get these off the ground. It is not the consulate installing more Mexican bureaucrats or diplomats in these communities. It's people that live in these communities, even if they're 600-700 miles away from Kansas City or St. Louis, that are part of the leadership of these Comisiones. And so that's the general structure of them, or idea of what they're supposed to, or how they're coming together. And they really serve a lot of functions in the communities. And it varies depending on how big or small a community is, the dynamics, how close they are to where the consulate is. And what they do is serve aid functions. So kind of that, what the consul is supposed to be doing, they're doing that on the ground in rural Kansas and rural Nebraska and the urban places in these states. And they're writing about discrimination. They're writing about Mexicans being arrested. They're writing about conflicts with the police. they're also organizing Fiestas Patrias and other smaller celebrations as well, just to get the community together. And they're securing funds, like I mentioned, for these celebrations from the consul, from the Mexican state. They sometimes will alert the consul to more pressing cases of incarceration, someone that's been incarcerated for a while, and maybe Mexican being incarcerated for a while that maybe no one had known about, or like with labor, helping families secure compensation assistance and things like that. Sometimes the Comisiones do serve the purposes of the Mexican state in a more blunt way. So for those that, or just to contextualize a little more, in the background of the 1910s, 1920s, 1930s, is the Mexican Revolution in the 1910s, the aftermath of that, the rise of anti-clerical laws in the 1920s, and then the outburst of the Cristero War, where Catholic partisans are revolting against the Mexican state and these anti-clerical laws. And not only are the consuls very aware of that and getting directives from the Mexican state, but these communities are very aware of it, and they are often coming from places like central Mexico, which was a hotbed for the Cristero War. And so none of this is happening in a vacuum. What is happening in Mexico is just as urgent and meaningful in the lower Midwest. And so what these comisiones sometimes will do is report on people that they think are dissenters or that support the Catholic partisans. And yes, sometimes their motivation may be another reason, maybe a business owner they don't like or something like that, but they're using the conflict to their advantage and to maintain order in these communities. And I think that was really fascinating to me as I was doing this research, that there is this level of surveillance by the Mexican state through these comisiones during the 10s and 20s and 30s.
That's really interesting. And it's interesting too that through the consulates and then through the comisiones, that the Mexican state sees these communities as still part of Mexico, and that that they're not immigrants that have been that are now part of a different state, but that they are part of both states, and that the Mexican government wants to maintain those kinds of connections. So one of my other thoughts on this was, are there conflicts between the communities and their consulates? And is that coming through, does that show up within these organizations at all?
Yeah, that's a great question. So as you can imagine, me at the end there talking about the Cristero War, yes, these conflicts are popping up, and there are both community conflicts with the comisiones and then conflicts within the comisione or the comisione's relationship to the consul or the consulate. And sometimes it's conflicts over leadership. Who has the right to lead this community? Is it the comisione? And then, so for example, in Nebraska, they're in Scottsbluff, which is a rural area. Most of the Mexican migrants there are sugar beet laborers, and they have a comisione. They have multiple comisiones in a close range in a lot of rural towns, and about 5 or 6 rural towns there. But then there are 1 or 2 other organizations popping up in the late 20s, early 30s, calling themselves patriotic organizations, so being Mexican patriots, but writing the Kansas City consulate to say these comisiones don't represent us. If not, in addition to writing the consulate, they're also writing the Mexican ambassador in DC and writing directly to Mexico to the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, the Secretaría de Relaciones Exteriores. And they're saying the consul and his and the leadership he has installed in this community do not represent us. We represent the Mexican community of Scottsbluff, Nebraska, and we are not only do we represent this community, but we represent the interests of Mexicans in this community. So still pulling on their Mexican citizenship while they're in Western Nebraska, and not saying that they're not part of Mexico anymore. They're just saying this Mexican official does not represent us, and we should represent how we relate to Mexico. And there's more examples of conflicts similar to this about leadership. In Kansas City proper, Kansas City, Missouri, there's a battle over aid organizations in the early 1930s. So thinking this is the Great Depression, Mexican laborers are often the first fired, or at least the first underemployed folks during the Depression, and really going through this intense economic struggle. And there is an effort from both the Kansas City, or at first the Kansas City consul, to create an aid organization. He invites business leaders in the community, Mexican business leaders, to come together in, I think it's October of 1931. Not to get too much in the weeds, but what's really important there, he sends out this invitation for mid-October, and a week before that, a rival organization just announces that they've created an aid organization, and kind of undercutting the consul. And that organization had a longer history in Kansas City, the Unión Cultural Mexicana. They were formed in the mid-1920s. And what's interesting there is they create this aid organization. They're saying, we want to help Mexicans in need. Like, we can do it better than the consul. And while that's a specific conflict, it shows this longer leadership conflict in Kansas City. What ends up happening is that they merge the organizations. But because of that, the consul tries to take over the UCN, the Unión Cultural Mexicana, and sanction it as a comisione or a comisión, and say, no, I need to have oversight over this social organization that popped up, not naturally, but organically, I guess is a better way to put it, in Kansas City. And he's trying to overtake it. And it's just an interesting level of leadership conflict. And who does the consul serve? Do they serve Mexico and the needs of the Mexican state, or do they serve the particularities of the Mexican migrants in the lower Midwest?
That conflict is so interesting, I think, in terms of, and I the idea that I love the idea that Mexican citizens living outside of the country are circumventing the consulate and going straight to the SRE, and sort of the way that they're leveraging their position against Mexican government organizations is really interesting as well. But one of the things that I thought was most interesting, because a lot of what you've talked about so far is happening within Mexican communities in the lower Midwest. But the importance of the Fiestas Patrias celebrations is really interesting to me, because these were public events. And as far as I can tell, they mainly were taking place in urban areas, the big celebrations. But that the idea that they're public is interesting. And you posit the idea that the performance of these celebrations, quote, balanced a Mexican past and an American present for members of these communities. So could you talk a bit about why it was important for the creation and maintenance of a Mexican identity to hold public celebrations, especially for Mexican Independence Day, but also occasionally for Cinco de Mayo?
Sure. Yeah, these celebrations were huge. I hinted at that earlier with the Kansas City one in 1926, but they're going on throughout the 10s, 20s, and 30s during this time. And while often they are in urban centers, I do want to say that there are popular ones in rural areas as well, and both in Kansas and Nebraska. And they are drawing, so when you think about it, especially these sugar beet laborers, sometimes they're on farms and they're not really in the towns they're near, they're just living out on these farms. And so these smaller celebrations are even a chance for these farm communities to come together in one central location and say, no, we're not just living in a small house next to this farm. We are a larger community in Western Nebraska, in Western Kansas. We are not just sugar beet laborers. We are people that celebrate together and gather together. And I think that's a really important aspect of these celebrations, of them being in public, of non-Mexicans being able to attend them, is they show a depth of these migrants and these communities, that they're not just laborers. And too often we can fall into that trap of just like, okay, these folks coming here to work, and that's all they are. And then when they don't have work anymore, they either have to leave or decide to leave. And clearly, having these annual celebrations, they're making a larger claim to either these urban centers or these rural spaces and saying, we belong here. We're literally in the streets. We are renting halls. These are our institutions too, even if we don't use them all the time. And yeah, these celebrations claim public space, claim cultural space, and especially when some of these communities are segregated to like literally the other side of the tracks. They're coming into a different part of the city and saying, we're here. You may marginalize us most of the time, but this is our time to say this is our town, this is our city. And maybe it's not always that blunt of a political demand as I'm framing it, but it is clearly sending that message. And you see the newspapers of these towns writing about it. They're recognizing that these folks are here and that this celebration is something to be enjoyed. And as far as this idea of blending a Mexican past and an American present, is they're celebrating the independence of Mexico and the history of Mexico. There's 2 days of festivities where there's speeches and lectures about Mexican history. There's a recreation of the cry of Father Hidalgo, which kicked off the independence movement in 1810. And it's really interesting looking at oral histories from folks interviewed in the 70s and 80s, and they talk about these celebrations in the 20s and 30s, and they remember this. So it's also something teaching Mexico to the second generation, the generation that may become Mexican American in the 40s and 50s, and teaching them about Mexico and having that longer memory of what Mexico is and what Mexico meant to these communities. But they're doing it in the United States. Sometimes they're blending Mexican independence with U.S. independence, not blending the days, but they'll have floats that have Father Hidalgo and George Washington, and clearly linking the celebration of independence there. And that is not just anecdotal, that's happening lots of times and in other parts of the country as well. And it's just important to think about that and recognize that idea of blending independence there.
It's so fascinating to me. My maternal grandfather was born and raised in Wellington, Kansas, and so I'm just imagining how interesting the idea that these things are all happening in a place where he grew up. But I'm going to change direction here with the questions now and start to talk more about research issues, because you were an ARENET Transnational Fellow in 2016, and you collected documents as part of your research term in Mexico City. And I'm wondering what the relationship is, I guess, between the materials that you collected in Mexico City versus the materials that you collected in the US. But if you could also speak more generally about your time in Mexico City as an ARENET Fellow.
Sure. I love talking about Mexico City. It's just getting down there was great. It totally sent me on a new trajectory for the project. It didn't blow up my project, but just made me realize a lot of things that I needed to talk about and that were essential to understanding the Mexican migrants of the lower Midwest. And so just getting into Mexico City, just being steeped in the cultural institutions, and just learning so much more about the Mexican Revolution, I think was essential for my thinking. Going to just anywhere you go, there's a mural about the revolution, and you just start thinking about it as you're researching, and then you're realizing, okay, I'm talking about the 10s and 20s, and I know a little bit about the Mexican Revolutionary Project, and now I'm learning more. And it's like, okay, this is everywhere. And even if these murals are created in the 30s, this is everywhere in the cultural ideas of the folks living in Mexico. Clearly, it's retained by the folks migrating to the United States. And so just getting that sense was huge. And then getting into the archive, you know, it was my first major trip for this project, like a research trip that I spent more than a week in a place. So I'm glad it was the first major trip, but it still changed what I thought my project would be about. And very quickly I realized that this needed to be a transnational history and a regional history. And what either I had already found or what I was soon to find in the local archives in the United States was, it looked like a history that was of isolated communities and not a lot of communities. When you take the archive at face value in the United States, whether it's a state archive or some other collection, when you look at their collections, it seems like the history doesn't reach that far back. You get this impression that this is if you want to talk about ethnic Mexicans in the lower Midwest or the Midwest, that it's a post-1950 history or post-war history. That's what some of these archives communicated to me. And often to find where migrants were, it seems like they're just laborers in the collections they are. And I've already talked about that a little bit, so I won't harp on it, but where you find Mexican migrants in the archive seems limited at first. But these consulate records showed me a whole different story. They showed this longer history, that there's a pre-1950, pre-World War II history of Mexican communities in the region. I very quickly got a sense of how these communities were connected, that these weren't isolated communities in rural towns or even in Kansas City, that they were connected across the city and throughout the region by many things, but first and foremost, their consulates. And the archive also gave me a sense, the Archive of Mexico City gave me a sense of the role of consulates in these communities. I knew they would be actors, but I thought maybe they'd be minor actors. And as I'm talking about today, and as I write about even more in my work, these were essential institutions, maybe sometimes hindrances to community, and it was more against that struggle against the consul that a community came together. But either way, they were major players in what these communities look like and how they were connected, and also how they were connected to Mexico.
Your work was mainly in the Ministry of Foreign Relations archive?
Oh yeah, sorry.
Okay. No,
yeah,
that's okay. Just wanted to
Yeah,
clarify.
I did all my research there. I thought about going to the AGN, and maybe one day I will. But I also heard some horror stories about the AGN, so I was happy where I was.
The SRE is my favorite archive in the whole city, and I can't do research for myself there, but it's a fantastic archive. So
yeah, I loved it. The archivists were so helpful. Yeah, it was an amazing archive, and a great bakery right across the street. That was great to go to for lunch. And so I don't want to shortchange the U.S. archives. There are these awesome oral history archives that I use that complement this work I do on consulates and open up other avenues about Mexican migrant life in the lower Midwest. And even some of the church records and state archives were immensely helpful, and the church is downplayed in the consular files, and at least during this time. So it was great to get that broader perspective from the state archive still.
Great. And I loved your initial point that part of going to do research somewhere is not just what you find in the archive, but what you're experiencing in the larger context as well. And that you came to understand how significant the Mexican Revolution is, because you can't turn a corner in Mexico City without, I mean, probably both streets are named after something having to do with the revolution. So but that we learn a lot from being in the place that we're studying, not just the documents that we're finding in the archive, which I think is always a good point to make, especially now that we're sort of doing more and more digital research through digital collections, that there's still a value in going to a place to do your research. But speaking of digital collections, you've recently released your digital humanities, digital history project mapping the Mexican Midwest. Could you tell us more about this project and how it complements the history of Mexican communities in the region that you are writing about? You mentioned, you say, quote, visualizing early 20th century Mexican community formation through mapping. I'm wondering how this is changing our perception of the lower Midwest. And while you answer, I'm actually going to put the link to the page in the chat.
Okay,
so you
great.
go ahead and I will do that so people can see the page.
Yeah, so the part of the idea of the project is for the early 20th century is literally putting Mexican communities on the map. And that showing where they are, how many there were, and what they consisted of. And I think just that alone is something meaningful for a place that is often perceived of as a rural white space. I mean, you don't have to look, you can look to the 2016 election and just the punditry of that and how, oh yeah, white Americans in rural places, the Midwest, that's what the Midwest is synonymous with. And this mapping project, the work some of my colleagues are doing on Mexicans in the Midwest and Latinx communities in the Midwest shows that it's not the case. This is not white rural space, that there's a long history of Latinx communities in the region. And it's really important to tell that history. And I hope my project contributes to that telling and is a public way of doing that, to giving the general public an avenue into understanding this history. And I think what is good about where the project is now is showing that and representing that. And where I think my project is going is showing the dynamism of these communities. And it starts by me mapping churches and comisiones and saying, here's the institutional life of these communities, and here's where they were. And also what I'm hoping to do moving forward is visualizing naturalization records and showing these migration routes from Mexico through the United States. I hesitate to say to the Midwest because that implies a final destination, which part of my work kind of disrupts that idea and show, not that I'm arguing that they're permanent transients, but that movement is important to understanding this community and that folks didn't necessarily want to remain in the United States, and it's important to recognize that. Mm-hmm. And so these naturalization records show that movement, but also have the potential to show individual stories of where folks moved through the United States, and that it's not just, okay, they left Mexico and settled in Kansas City. It's like, no, they moved through these different regions, and I think that's important. And also showing some of these social networks I talk about and religious networks. So eventually I'll be plotting the route of Father Ocampo, who was a priest, an exiled priest that left Mexico or forced out of Mexico, came to Kansas and helped fundraise for these different churches that some of them are still there today in Kansas. And he moved through rural and urban spaces in eastern and central Kansas. And so plotting his route, I think will show how dynamic these communities were. And also showing leisure activities, showing baseball leagues. There's a baseball and basketball leagues in eastern Kansas organized by Mexican communities in the 1920s and 1930s that can also show off the dynamic aspects of the regional community. And overall, what I think my digital history project does is show that this has long been Mexican space, and that this is space that Mexicans shaped. They didn't just reside there, that they transformed it.
Excellent. My last question for you, and we've already started getting some questions for the Q&A, but leading off of that and the idea that your digital history project is mapping these communities and that also mapping movement, which I think is really important and interesting. But I'm wondering how your history of Mexicans in the lower Midwest is challenging narratives of American history. So for example, when I mentioned your article in the journal History Nebraska to several friends who are familiar with the with the state, I have been told emphatically that there are no Latinx in Nebraska, that Nebraska is a white state. Now, that not even back in the 20s, 30s, or 40s, but that, and what's interesting is that there's a growing academic literature that disputes this. And you, again, because I had the pleasure to read a chapter of your dissertation, that you talk about some of that historiography. But do you see a change in popular representations of the lower Midwest as your research and others demonstrates the diversity of that region?
So I'll start with the popular perception first, because I got at that a little bit with the digital history project. And so what I see is efforts to change that popular perception. I think the comment from the friend of yours about Nebraska is still the popular perception, unfortunately, but there are folks doing great work to change that perception. And some of it's coming from the folks I've met during my research or the archives I've been to. So the Missouri Valley Special Collections, they have this great oral history collection. It's called the Hispanic Oral History Collection or Program. And they've digitized all their interviews, and it's interviews from the late 70s and early 80s of folks that grew up in and around Kansas City. So there's great stories of the 20s, 30s, and 40s. And not only have they digitized these oral histories, but they've also created digital exhibits from these oral histories and from some of their other collections that show the long history of ethnic Mexicans and Latinx folk in the region, and specifically in Kansas City. And I think those public exhibits are crucial to changing the perception of this being solely white space, as some people have. And this work's also being done in Nebraska, in Omaha and in Scottsbluff, in Western Nebraska. There's museums that highlight the Mexican experience in the first half of the 20th century. I've been lucky to meet a great activist in Nebraska, Marty Ramirez, and he is organizing with some other folks to demand protections for Latinx workers in Nebraska, the meatpacking plant workers. And their concern is not only those immediate demands, but also educating folks about the longer history of the Mexican and Latinx experience in Nebraska. And so I think that shift is coming. I hope my mapping project can contribute to that. And I know the work of my colleagues on the Mexican Midwest, on the Latinx Midwest, it will change that perception. And that it sounds like there's some other public history projects or work that will influence the public coming out soon. So I look forward to that. So yeah, public perception wise, that's what I think is happening. That the change hasn't come yet, but it sounds like it's on the horizon. And as far as what my scholarly work is doing in challenging common narratives of American history, I think one thing it does is it challenges our ideas of the West and this East-West movement, and this idea of the 20th century culminating in European assimilation to white American norms. And I think what my research shows is, one, just a different trajectory of movement, the South-North movement, and also a circular movement, moving within the region and even moving to and from Mexico during this time, and also not being dependent on settlement and on so-called assimilation, that Mexican migrants are retaining their culture, and that culture is actually transforming these places, and maybe not always being celebrated by non-Mexicans, but Mexican migrants are saying this is a culture that should be celebrated and not a culture that should be diminished and erased through assimilation. And I think that's an important narrative that many folks show who study the Latinx experience in the 20th century, and I think it's important to see that in the lower Midwest as well. And I also think this history shows that the region is a multiracial space, and there's potential there. And this very much is something I am glad that there are other folks doing this work throughout the Midwest and throughout the US. And I think there's a lot of potential there, or a lot to be learned about what other scholars are doing about demonstrating that this is a multiracial space, when so often our public perception is this is white space.
Yeah. And that has implications well beyond scholarship in terms of systematic racism and recognizing the long history of the presence of a population to be able to make sure that services within states respond to those communities. And we're certainly seeing issues with that now. But it's my turn to stop talking, and we're going to have questions. And our first question is from Pete. Here you are. Pete, would you like to ask your question directly, or should I read it for you? I think he sent it to me. I'm going to unmute you.
Hi, Tracy.
There you go. Hi, Pete. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much this has been a great talk, Bryan. This has been really, really great. I had a quick question about repatriation. You briefly mentioned that it was different in the Midwest than the Southwest, that the character of it was different. And if I understood you correctly, you were saying that the consulates in the Midwest played a role in shaping that difference. And I was wondering if you could go into a bit more detail about how repatriation differed between the Midwest and the Southwest.
Yeah, thank you for that question. So one of the ways I talk about this difference in my work is the difference in numbers and percentages. So the Southwest, just the sheer numbers are huge of Mexicans being forced to back to Mexico, or back to Mexico isn't the right way to say it, because many of these people are American citizens of Mexican descent, and they're maybe going to Mexico for the first time, or if not the first time, because they were moving back and forth with their families whenever they visited families still in Mexico. It wasn't their home. But the sheer numbers of the Southwest is one difference. The other difference that I really get into is the percentage of the population loss. So despite the large amount of people of Mexican descent being forced to go to Mexico as part of repatriation, the numbers in the Southwest are about 10 to 15% of the Mexican population, of the ethnic Mexican population. In contrast, the Upper Midwest, the cities and towns around the Great Lakes, so thinking about Chicago and Illinois, Indiana, Detroit and Michigan, the population loss up there is huge, over 50% in those three states, with Indiana losing about 75% of their ethnic Mexican population because of repatriation. And so the lower Midwest sits between that, around 20%. And so this is loss, and this matters, and this is devastation still, but the fact that it operates in between these levels got me to dig deeper into, so why does this look different? Why is it more about 20% compared to the 10 to 15% in the Southwest, or the over 50% in the Upper Midwest? And so part of why it looks different is this is not the former territory of Mexico, so it's not the Southwest. This wasn't once Mexican land. So there's there are different social, political, and economic histories there. And so for the most part, in 1930, Mexican migrants are newcomers to the lower Midwest. So the folks that were already living there, white Americans that were already living there, or even European immigrants that recently came to the region, in some ways, they're trying to figure out who Mexicans are and where they fit on the American racial spectrum. And so if there's a town with an African-American population, Mexican migrants often exist on the racial spectrum in between African-Americans and white Americans and European immigrants. Sometimes they're even grouped in with European immigrants. When Mexican migrants are the only non-white population in a town or city, they more often experience life like African-Americans in the South or the urban North. And so those racial dynamics are part of it. It depends where they are. So if they're more accepted, they're not facing some of the racial discrimination that contributes to repatriation during this period. Another part of it is they're using settlement houses in unique ways. They're using it as a refuge in the lower Midwest, whether it's the ones that I look at are in Omaha, St. Louis, and Kansas City. And they're able to stay in these cities because of these settlement houses, whereas in places like California, settlement houses are helping organize repatriation and pushing people of Mexican descent out. And so that difference there is really important. And then as far as consuls go, they don't have much money to give, but they are trying to give financial aid to these communities. At the same time, they are also requesting cheaper train rates to repatriate. So it's not like they're not contributing to the repatriation of ethnic Mexicans. It's more that Mexican migrants have these other resources, or their racial dynamics are different, and they're able to secure some funds to stay from the consulate. And that's the most of it. There's a little more I can get into for incarceration, but I worry I'd talk too long about that.
Okay, well, we don't have any new questions from the audience, so I'm going to ask a question, and you all can take that time to formulate some other questions for Bryan. But one of my questions, I have so many questions for you. It's such an interesting and important project. But I'm wondering if you're finding women in the archival record in relation to the consulates, but also in identity formation in this region, in the lower Midwest.
Yeah, absolutely. So women are throughout these records, and you asked me about the Cruz Azul in relation to the Comisiones Honorificas, and so the Cruz Azul was a women's auxiliary organization, okay. And so they're not as prominent in the lower Midwest. So there's about 25 Comisiones at one point or another. And maybe only 2 or 3 Cruz Azul brigades. And they are doing a lot of the work that the Comisiones are doing. They represent a female leadership in these communities. And they serve an important role, but where I really see women in these records are being advocates on behalf of their family, especially after a breadwinner goes missing or is killed on the job or something like that. So whether in Mexico or in the United States, women are writing consuls for the whereabouts of their family members, or they're writing consuls to help them make a workers' compensation claim or to secure a life insurance payout.
Well, I have another research question for you. Are you researching in consulates, in still existing consulates, in Mexican consulates in the United States? Or I guess what are your main archives in the United States?
Okay, so in the US, I use state archives, so Nebraska, Kansas, and Missouri. And then I also use some public libraries have special collections. So the Kansas City Public Library has the Missouri Valley Special Collections. Okay. I also use NARA, the National Archives and Records Administration. So I use naturalization records from there, and federal prison records from there. And so there's a mix of that. I haven't had much correspondence with current consulates. So the Kansas City consulate still exists. The St. Louis one doesn't. There now is one in Omaha, which is actually interesting because the Omaha in 1920, the community there tried to petition for a new consulate in Omaha. That petition failed, but eventually the Mexican state created a consulate there a lot later in the 20th century. And so I'm not using their current archives, especially because my project ends in 1950. So anything from those consulates would be at the SRE now. Yeah.
Okay. Cynthia, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Bryan, thank you for this very, very interesting talk and the detail with which you've answered Tracy's excellent questions. I've just learned so much. My familiarity with the historiography is slight, but I was thinking of one of the really leaders, I think, in the study of Mexican Americans in the Midwest is Zaragoza Vargas. And if I remember correctly, his work sort of begins chronologically where you end. But what I found interesting, or what I find interesting, what I'd like to ask you about, is that his insistence is on labor history, and the assertion of Mexican identity and Mexican American identity in what I guess we might call the upper Midwest. He's looking a little bit more at Detroit and Illinois, also distinguishing from the Southwest. So I was just wondering, your focus on community and building identity, in what ways, although you did talk about grievances that came out of labor situations, how do you distinguish your work, or how can you see it linking with other focuses on labor history?
That's a great question. Thank you. And I do look at labor, and when I first started researching and thinking about my writing, I thought this would be mostly a labor history, and it's really not just the consulate records, but especially the consulate records, church records, oral histories, that really pushed me to tell a bigger story. And I think, I mean, I came into history because of labor history. So I'm not trying to downplay the importance of labor history, or the fact that the first step to migrants coming here is that they're seen as laborers and that they're looking for employment opportunities. What I am trying to do here is show that these folks are more than just laborers, and labor is just, being a laborer is just one part of their life in the United States. And not to get too philosophical or political, is that I think it's important for us to see ourselves as bigger than just our job or just this one thing. And so something I write about in my work is that Mexican migrants were laborers, they were churchgoers, they were organizers, they were baseball players, they were drinkers, they're everything. We're human beings, and we contain many facets, and it's important to recognize that. And I wanted this history to show that. And I think part of what helps me bring that out is looking at this as a regional community and looking at this movement. So yes, maybe a family or a person was a sugar beet laborer from, I don't know, April to October, and then they came in Scottsbluff, Nebraska, and then they came to Omaha, and they were going to dances at the Butchers and Workmen's Temple. And so they're maybe still a labor organization, but they're celebrating and just enjoying life. And I think that's important. I mean, Vargas has written two very important books for me understanding the Mexican experience in the Midwest and generally. So I wouldn't be here without him writing those books. So I'm definitely learning from those books, and has helped me write the dissertation, soon to be book, that I'm writing now.
Thank you.
Okay, excellent. Okay, I think we've got Jonathan again. Let me make sure. There. Jonathan?
Hello?
Can you hear us? Okay.
Hi.
The floor is yours.
Yeah, so sorry. Yeah, thank you. I'm so sorry, Bryan, for the technical issues, but thank you for a really fantastic conversation. So I just finished reading Aaron Sanchez's new book, Homeland, and he covers sort of this very similar part in the early 20th century. I'm curious, Bryan, to hear about your work. What's happening in this moment between like sort of immigration waves from Mexico as a result of the Mexican Revolution and the Cristero Revolt and these sorts of other issues you laid out, and then US-born Mexicanos that have perhaps been in the area or migrated to the Midwest. I'm curious, were there any tensions? Because Aaron argues, right, that one of the tensions was that like in the effort for Mexico to create a Mexican nationalism, as you laid out with these consulates and other forms of forging patria, it sort of excluded US-born Mexicanos by saying like, well, they're not Mexican enough, right? And so I'm just curious how that shows up in your own work.
That's a great question. Thank you. So what do I think about that? I think I don't see enough of that tension, because while the Mexican Revolution is generating this initial migration in the 1910s, it is a small migration until 1920, or a slow trickle until 1920. And so, I haven't read Sanchez's book yet, but I am curious if what he's talking about is these communities that have that longer history of this being formerly Mexican territory, even if we know there's that new wave in the 1900s and 1910s, and that there is that conflict, but there is less of that I'm Mexican and you're American conflict that sounds like you're asking about here. It is certainly a blended community of citizenship, but that line doesn't come out until I'm starting to wind down my work, until the 1940s, and there's this increased drive for citizenship, whether it's because of participation in World War II as a soldier, or because of the laws we don't talk about as much, of the Smith Act forcing folks essentially to naturalize, and just the fear from repatriation, even if a community didn't experience the harshness of it as much in the lower Midwest, is still very clearly being talked about in Mexican communities. So that line isn't there, but I will share an interesting tidbit just to kind of get at what you're asking about. Is there is a point where the way these communities are, now I'm trying to think, it's the Kansas City community, the UCM, the Unión Cultural Mexicana, they criticize the consul by saying he's not Mexican enough, someone appointed by the Mexican state that is from Mexico. One of their open letters in a local paper, they say that his colloquialisms are from California, and essentially that he is, they're accusing him of being Mexican American, it seems. And I think that gets to what your question is at, but I don't see that across the board. And especially these oral histories that I uncover about the 20s and 30s, there are Mexican and Mexican Americans participating in this. And there really seems to be an effort to bridge that possible divide overall.
Excellent. Well, I'm afraid we're going to have to bring the session to a close now. Many thanks to Bryan Winston for such a fascinating interview. And as always, to Greta de Leon, the Executive Director of ARENET and co-host of our Zoom talks, who is working the tech behind the scenes today. And mil gracias, many thanks to all of you for joining us today and for fascinating questions as well. We hope that you can join us at the end of this month, April 2021, for 2 weeks of presentations on Brazil in our series, Iberian Borderlands in Cyberspace. First, on April 23rd, we will be interviewing Mary Karash on her chapter, Riverine Borderlands and Multicultural Contacts in Central Brazil, 1775 to 1835. And then on April 30th, join us for an homenaje for John Montero, hosted by Cynthia Radding. And many thanks. Thank you again, Bryan, for such a great talk. And we will see you for the next one.
Thank you so much.